There's a teaching that's out and about in the body of Christ that's been promoted for a number of years now called the Seven Mountains, a teaching that I find very problematic. It's all about identifying the seven spheres of influence, but these are spheres of influence that are places of power, politics, the economy or business, marketplace, education, the arts, media, the military. These are places that, according to this teaching, Christians need to be positioning ourselves and getting educations and going into these fields where we can be elected into office and climb up the corporate ladder and begin to influence from the top down. And Daniel is being used as an example of someone who did that, who was brought into the palace as an advisor to Nebuchadnezzar, or Joseph. But we forget that Daniel and Joseph both, went through a huge amount of persecution. Daniel was thrown into a furnace and into the lion's den, and Joseph spent years in prison, falsely accused. This week, as we celebrate Jesus' ascension, we need to remember that Jesus ascended to the right hand of the Father after he had first descended into hell. He had gone into the grave, and to announce to those that had died during the times of Noah, to proclaim the good news to the spirits that were in prison. According to the creeds, Jesus descended before he was raised to the right hand of the Father, and we too, if we want to live with Christ, we need to die with Christ. And so the way of the cross is not a way of just ascendancy and of ascension without the persecution and without the giving of our lives. We need to be willing to give our lives fully as a sacrifice, as living sacrifices. When we think about the seven mountains, I think we need to counter that teaching. With John the Baptist, he cites directly from Isaiah chapter 40, and he says that he is a voice crying in the wilderness, not from the high places, but from the desert. Prepare ye all, prepare ye the way of the Lord. In other words, you all prepare the way of the Lord in the desert, Prepare the way of the Lord. And the valleys will be lifted up, and the mountains will be brought down, so that all flesh will see the glory of the Lord. Valleys, what are these valleys? In contrast to the seven mountains, which, at least according to Isaiah's prophecy, need to be brought down, not climbed up and ruled from the top of, but actually brought down. Remember, mountains were places where there were high places. And in ancient Israel, these were the places where where idols were, where there were altars to the false gods. And the greatest error of Israelite kings was to not tear down the high places, but to go and to make sacrifices at the high places. And so we need to be about that. We need to be about identifying the high places and then calling people away from idolatrous worship of these places of power and privilege. These high places need to be brought down, And Christians do have a role to do that. Just like Moses went before Pharaoh and he called Pharaoh to let the people go and let the slaves go, let the Israelite people, God's people, go. We need to identify seven low places or valleys. And I would say there are many Christians on the front lines already ministering to people who are being trafficked in being used as child labor or as sexual slaves. Another high place, a low place or valley would be just the huge refugee populations that are still leaving places like Syria and frontline war zones that need to be where injustices need to be addressed and where refugees need to be welcomed. We have global poverty, which is worse than it's been in a long time, especially now with the COVID-19 epidemic. Global poverty is on the rise. We need to be addressing the root causes of this poverty. Homelessness. Everywhere we have homeless populations growing, and this is certainly a valley that needs to be raised up. Addiction. the opioid epidemic, and just the increased use of fentanyl and just other prescription drugs and alcohol. Clearly this is a valley that needs to be lifted up, as is the prison industrial complex, the mass incarceration of human beings that's happening in the United States and in Europe and all over the world. This is certainly a valley that needs to be lifted up, so that all flesh can see the glory of the Lord. What are some other valleys that need to be lifted up? When we think about this image of mountains coming down and valleys being lifted up, we're actually given a picture of something, of a flatland. Not that God just prefers a flatland like this beach, but it's a picture of equality, which is what we have in the right past post-Pentecost. Today is Pentecost Sunday, and one of the results of the pouring out of the Spirit was that people had things in common, and there was no one in need. And people sold fields and properties and brought them to the apostles. And this was all about, funding mission and meeting the needs of the most needy people. And today we have an opportunity for a new global mission movement that needs funding, that needs recruits, that needs all kinds of resources. Let's be about this work of the kingdom and not fall into the seduction of our culture and the priorities that our culture, the 7 mountains that our culture would consider the places of influence. Let's, of course, if we're called into those places, go for it. But we are called to be salt. We are called to be light, yeast in all of these places, and to be a prophetic voice in places of power. But let's remember how Jesus did it. He didn't go to Jerusalem. He went to the margins. He went to Galilee. May God bless you as you pursue his kingdom first and foremost.